despite facing international condemnation over the war, President Putin predicts Russia won't be cut off from the rest of the world. During a visit to eastern Russia alongside Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, Putin said foreign powers can't isolate Russia, and Russia has no intention of isolating itself. He also tried to justify the war by once again claiming it was necessary to protect Russian security. It comes a day after Putin had a, quote, tough meeting with the Austrian chancellor, who challenged the Russian leader to end the war immediately. Ian, I'll take this back to you. Putin thinks that he will not be isolated. To an extent, economically, right at this moment, he might be right. At what point does the world find a way to disengage itself from Russia so he can be isolated?
I think that the Western world is isolating itself from Russia, and I think that that decoupling is permanent. The only major engagement that the advanced industrial democracies still have with Russia at this point is oil and gas from Russia to Europe. The oil is going to be cut off in all likelihood in the coming months. We've already heard from a number of major European leaders they're moving in that direction. Even the Germans said by the end of the year they want it done. Gas is about 2% of Russian GDP to Europe. That's probably going to be cut off too in relatively short order, but maybe not this year. The problem is that we're only talking about the rich democracies. When you talk about the rest of the world, they're not on board. And so this idea that the international community is going to make Russia a pariah, Mika, there's no international community. I mean, even when they went to the Human Rights Council, they said, let's kick Russia off of it. The fact is the United States is the only country among the top 10 in population in the world that voted in favor of removing Russia there. Not Mexico, not Pakistan, not Brazil, not Indonesia, of course not China, not India. That says a hell of a lot. And that's not about economic pain. That was just a symbolic vote to say that what the Russians are doing is beyond the pale. So we can't kid ourselves that the United States has the world on our side. What we have is NATO on our side. It's much more consolidated and purposeful and mission-oriented than it was before this invasion. And we have a few allies in Asia on our side, too. They're rich democracies.
Yeah, rich democracies, also democracies that run the global economy for the most part. But we're not going to have, though, a USS Missouri moment at the end of this war, regardless of how well the Ukrainians do. It does seem like the world order is going to be disorienting and unstable. But also, my God, it sounds like we're going back into the 70s and the 1980s, that we're going to have a bipolar world and you're going to have democracies against autocracies.
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I agree that the United States is going to be in a new Cold War with Russia, and certainly NATO is going to have much more alignment in that regard. But the idea that the world's democracies are together, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I think that the United States is in many ways more powerful than it was 20, 30 years ago. If you look at the role of the U.S. dollar, if you look at the role of America in terms of commodities, food, oil, and gas, you look at the situation of U.S. and global finance, I mean, countries have to follow the Americans when we say this is the way it's going to go. But as a democracy, I mean, I just don't think a lot of countries around the world think that the United States is a political system to be followed. And so the idea that the world is going to fragment into democracies versus autocracies, and the U.S. is leading the democratic camp, I mean, you know, especially as I look forward to 2024, it's hard to imagine that we're going to be speaking credibly on that front. I mean, if we were playing bridge right now, democracy's our weakest suit is the United States.
Hey, Ian, on that.
I couldn't disagree with you more, but I understand it's a fashionable pose to take. And so you take that pose. I think Western democracy over the past month and a half has been revitalized. I think NATO has been revitalized. I think it's been a defining moment. I think you have people that were following Vladimir Putin and the Republican Party and people who were mindlessly following autocrats that suddenly remember exactly their democratic impulse impulses. I think you looked at Poland and you see a country that was slipping in Hungary's direction. This has been a defining moment for them. I just couldn't disagree with you more that democracy is not our strongest suit. This is a war between autocracy and the West. This is, and don't ask me, ask Zelensky. He will tell you he is willing to fight and die to be associated with the West, to be associated with democracy, to be associated with free markets.
Well, I guess my point here, I don't disagree with anything you just said, Joe, but you're talking fundamentally mostly about the Europeans. I mean, Poland today is absolutely a leader of Europe. And before this invasion, it was seen as, in many ways, an outlier. And I think that Europe is much stronger today because they're welcoming 5 million Ukrainians into their homes, not into refugee camps, not into tents, literally part of the community. And it's because a democratic Ukraine is being invaded by Putin for nothing more than the desire to determine their own future and their own government. But I take issue with the idea that the Americans, that we are going to be consistent in that going forward. It's true that right now, Democrats and Republicans actually think that Putin is more of an enemy than their own opponents across the aisle. I'm not sure that that's going to have staying power. I mean, we're not going to see those Ukrainian refugees in the United States. For Europe, this is an existential threat to democracy. For the average American, I would argue this is much more of a threat to Ukraine. And I worry that the idea that the Americans can lead a war of democracies versus autocracies is more challenging going forward. For the West as a whole, multilaterally, sure. For the United States as the exceptional, indispensable nation, I think that moment is much more challenging, Joe.
Ian, who do you think is guaranteeing democracy in Poland? Who do you think the Poles are looking to guarantee their freedom? Who do you think the Lithuanians are looking to guarantee their freedom? Who do you think the Estonians are looking to guarantee their freedom? With all due respect to Luxembourg, it's not Luxembourg, it's the United States of America. And they, when you have U.S. troops in Poland being treated like liberators, because they certainly remember what it was like the last time Moscow started to move on Poland. They look to the United States, and they see those troops as not to belabor the point, but my God, they look to America. They are still, despite how we look at ourselves, they still look at us as the guarantors of their freedom and their democracy. Do they not?
I think that's true. The United States has by far the largest military in the world, and the U.S. is standing up and providing enormous support, forward deployment. Will probably be permanent bases in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Bulgaria, and in Romania. I also think that despite the fact that the Americans have for many administrations now been telling the Europeans, you are not paying enough for your defense. You think you have this peace dividend, but you have to pay attention to national security. We're seeing the Germans now committed to 2% spend of GDP for military support. We see the Finns, the Swedes are going to be joining NATO later this year. We see all of these countries doing much more, not because of America, but because of Putin. So again, my question here is not that the United States is to be questioned militarily. That support is there. But I also remember it wasn't so many years ago when the U.S. had a president that said that NATO was obsolete. And I wonder whether it's the military strength of the Americans isn't going away, but will the Americans still be politically committed consistently over time through different administrations to leading the world's democracies when, frankly, whoever loses a national election in the United States doesn't believe that its own political system is legitimate. That's the challenge and the tension. Not that the United States is incapable of leading. We can lead NATO. We can lead sanctions globally. That is a military leadership. It's an economic leadership. But is the United States capable of leading the world ideologically in terms of our commitment to our own political principles? Are we capable of leading the world as a democracy? Can we lead by example in terms of this being a political system that other countries want to emulate? And I would respectfully suggest, Joe, that the answer to that question is shakier than it was 10, 20, or 30 years ago, and much shakier than our ability to continue to lead economically, militarily, technologically.
Well, but the answer, it may be a bit more shaky, but certainly the answer right now is yes. Finland and Sweden wants to get into NATO, not because of France, not because of Germany, but because of the United States. And they understand when the American president says we will defend every inch of NATO territory, they understand their freedom, their democracy rests with them. There is no doubt. And Jonathan Lemire, Ian does bring up a good point that I'll be the first to admit, that there is a deep unease because of 4 years of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump actually did everything he could to scuttle NATO. There is a deep unease that the United States will still be there 4 years from now. I would just suggest that over the past month and a half, it has been the United States and it has been NATO that has been a beacon and for Vladimir, for Zelensky. And he looks to the West, and I'm still of the opinion that the United States is still the leader of the West in every way, including aspirationally our democracy. Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.